So picture this. You've got the foundational driving rhythm of an entire musical genre, but the actual instrument it's named after doesn't even exist yet. Wild, right? Well, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unraveling a pretty fascinating musical mystery, the evolution of the jazz ride pattern. But we aren't just looking at the symbols themselves. Our main focus today is going to be on a brilliantly inventive pioneer named Tony Sbarbaro. We're going to see how his unique two-handed method literally forced drumming hardware to catch up with his imagination.
Here's our quick roadmap for the explainer. First up, the drum set's early days. Second, Sbarbaro's two-handed method. Third, the pattern evolves. Fourth, heavy metal problems. And finally, the Zildjian solution. We're going to be tracking a timeline right from 1917 all the way through the 1930s.
Section 1. The drum set's early days.
Okay, let's set the scene here. It's the 1910s. The drum set, at least as we know it today, simply did not exist. Instead, early drum kits were basically an attempt to take a massive, multi-person New Orleans second-line parade, where one person plays the snare, another plays the bass drum, another has the cymbals, and condense all of that down into a single seated player. It was a completely brand new concept, and honestly, the hardware was incredibly primitive. Musically, the pattern is that swinging, foundational rhythm that drives jazz forward. Think of that classic ding-dingity-ging sound. But here's the crazy part. Early drummers already had this complex rhythm playing in their heads, but they completely lacked the modern hardware to actually play it on. They were basically musical architects trying to build a skyscraper with a hammer and a handful of nails.
To put that into perspective, in the decade between 1917 and 1927, drummers were limited to some very specific kind of quirky components. You had a snare drum, a bass drum, a wood block, an oriental tom, and a small heavy cymbal. And that's about it. It was this cobbled-together collection of percussion elements. So if you wanted to play a continuous driving rhythm, you had to get incredibly creative with this exact, highly limited setup.
Section 2. Sbarbaro's two-handed method.
Enter Tony Sbarbaro. He was the drummer for the original Dixieland Jazz Band, which is widely recognized by historians as the first recorded jazz band in history. In a landmark November 1917 recording session in New York, Sbarbaro laid down a track called Oriental Jazz, and it's on this specific track that we hear the very first documented traces of what would eventually become the ride pattern. So the big question, how did he play a ride pattern without a ride cymbal? Well, he used a technique derived directly from his background in snare drum rudiments. He played flams. If you're not familiar, a flam is a technique where two hands hit a surface almost simultaneously. It creates this thick, sharp, decisive sound, like a bada. Sbarbaro basically applied the snare drum logic to non-drum surfaces. Just imagine the coordination and the auditory mechanics going on here. He is actively mimicking the continuous wash of a cymbal ride pattern by executing these rapid, two-handed flams.
Now, the absolutely crucial point is where he played it. In the B sections of Oriental Jazz, Sbarbaro completely shifts his setup. He moves away from the Oriental tom and targets a high-pitched wood block. Using his two-handed method, he literally hammered out this swinging, driving pattern on a small block of wood. He was creatively forcing his drum kit to evolve right there in the studio. It's just a breathtaking moment of musical innovation, really, because he was expressing an idea that simply outpaced the technology of his time. He didn't sit around waiting for a ride cymbal to be invented. He just built the rhythm out of wood and two swinging hands.
Section 3. The pattern evolves. So Sbarbaro lit the spark, and other drummers quickly began to adapt his core concept. Let's move forward just a few years to look at another drumming pioneer, Kaiser Marshall, who was playing with the Lucille Hegeman Band and the Fletcher Henderson Orchestra. Contrasting these two early methods reveals a massive shift. With Sbarbaro's 1917 method, you have those sharp flams on a woodblock, heavily rooted in snare technique. But by 1921, on tracks like Strut Ms. Lizzie, Marshall introduces a single-handed method. Suddenly, there are no flams. It's a steady rhythm played almost entirely by the single right hand, and he moved it completely off the woodblock and onto an oriental tom. You can hear the pattern smoothing out. It's becoming a lot less like a snare rudiment and much, much closer to that modern ride feel we know today.
If we look at this timeline, it maps out exactly how incredibly fast this rhythm was maturing. In 1917, Sbarbaro is forcing the pattern out of a woodblock with two hands. Fast forward to 1920 through 1924, and Marshall is smoothing it out with one hand on the toms. The rhythm is ready. The drummers are absolutely ready, but they are basically just waiting around for 1929, when a man named Abbadis Zildjian III opens a cymbal factory in the United States, bringing a massive hardware revolution to America just as the Great Depression is hitting.
Section 4. Heavy metal problems. Now you might be wondering at this point, why were drummers like Sbarbaro and Marshall beating up woodblocks and toms in the first place? Why not just hit a cymbal? Well, the answer is a massive mechanical limitation. In the early 20th century, cymbals were thick, heavy metal discs. Their primary purpose was for marching bands or orchestras to make a single, loud staccato crash to punctuate a big moment in the music. If you tried to play Sbarbaro's complex, continuous ride pattern on one of these things, it would sound terrible, just a muddy, washed-out roar of noise. Furthermore, unless a cymbal was made incredibly thick, hitting it repeatedly with a stick would literally cause it to shatter like glass. So for timekeeping, they were utterly useless.
Avidus Zildjian III realized this needed to change. He was the heir to a 300-year-old Ottoman alchemy secret for cymbal making, but he was also a very sharp businessman in America. There's this hilarious, legendary anecdote where Avidus decides to do some impromptu user testing. He packs a suitcase full of his cymbals, walks into a Boston hotel lobby where a dance band is setting up, and tells the drummer, "Hey, I want to be a drummer like you. Are any of these cymbals my friend gave me any good?" The drummer hits a few, closes the case, and actually tells him, quote, "Don't waste your time with these, kid. Get yourself some Zildjians." The drummer had no idea he was talking to Mr. Zildjian himself, but you know what? It proved to Avidus that musicians trusted his family's brand, he just needed to make the exact tools they were begging for.
Section 5. The Zildjian Solution. So Avidus decided to stop guessing and start listening directly to the giants of jazz drumming in the 1930s. He struck up a crucial relationship with the Chicago Flash himself, Gene Krupa. Krupa told him flat out, drummers need thinner cymbals. They needed something that responded to phrasing and accents, so they could finally move timekeeping off the snare drum and the woodblocks entirely. When you think about it, Krupa was asking for exactly the kind of instrument that Tony Sbarbaro had been pretending his woodblock was back in 1917.
Real quick aside here, because it wasn't just the ride cymbal they were fixing. Drummers at this time were actively hacking all their gear physically to fit this new music. The evolution of the hi-hat is incredible to look at. Step 1, they had a snowshoe that clashed cymbals right on the floor. Step 2, they built a lowboy elevated about 6 inches, but you couldn't reach it with your drumsticks. Finally, step 3, Joe Jones goes out, buys raw metal tubing, hands it to an engineer, and physically forces the cymbals up to stick height, inventing the modern hi-hat. They were quite literally engineering their own artistic tools in real time.
So back to Avidus. He listened and he delivered. He took Krupa's feedback, thinned out the metal using his family's secret alloy that wouldn't shatter, and birthed the modern cymbal catalog as we know it today. We're talking the ride, the crash, the hi-hat, the splash, pang, ping, and sizzle. Prior to this, cymbals were really just generic chunks of metal. Avidus actually coined the term ride cymbal. Finally, that beautiful, complex, driving rhythm that Tony Sbarbaro first carved out of a woodblock with 2 hands, it finally had a permanent, dedicated home on the drum kit.
And that brings us to our final thought for this explainer. The story of Tony Sbarbaro, Kaiser Marshall, and Avidus Zildjian shows us that artists don't just sit around and wait for technology to catch up to them. They force the issue. Sbarbaro used 2-handed flams on a block of wood because his musical idea was just too big for the instruments of 1917. So I want to leave you with this question to think about. If musical innovation happens when an artist's ideas outgrow their tools, what incredible ideas are waiting for the right instrument to be invented today? Thanks so much for exploring this amazing history with me, and keep listening for those patterns.